Hi, I'm Derek.
And I'm Eloa, and in this episode of Derek Draper's Space, we're going to be talking about chapter 3 of the book, Space to Decide.
Okay.
The book opens with this, the chapter opens with this lesson. If you want to be a creative, visionary, strategic leader, you have to create the space to be clear about what you think, make bold decisions, and communicate these with confidence. And there's a really lovely quote in the chapter by Michelle Obama, and I thought you could use that as the prompt because it really relates to the story.
Yep. Okay, let me just find it. I know it roughly, but yeah. No, so Michelle Obama said, you can't make decisions based on fear and the possibility of what might go wrong. We return to that, don't we, in there's three things we're going to look at, and that sums up one of them, doesn't it, really? Yeah, or two of them, actually, I think.
So Tell us about Hans.
Hans. Now, Hans was a guy that I worked with who had a pretty rough time when he was growing up, right? And it shaped how he felt about, I mean, I won't spoil the story, but how confident he was about expressing his opinions, right? He lived in quite a kind of forbidding, repressive family. And he was a finance guy. And as he went up through his career, he didn't have to give that many opinions, right? He had to know his stuff and he had to be able to kind of give facts. But as he became more senior, he was part of like leadership teams where people would be looking for him to contribute more than just some accounting facts, right? He was also being asked to just join the discussion, right? Discussion on marketing, what do you think, Hans? And he couldn't really do it outside of his own domain, where he was really good, actually, and very confident and impressive. Outside of his domain, he couldn't do it, right? And we looked a little bit about what had caused that and how we could free him. And interestingly, what as is often the case when you're trying to change your behaviour, if you tried a bit, it might not be as hard as you think, right? There's a great phrase in AA which is fake it until you make it, right? So Hans went in quite prepared initially, right, to make 1 or 2 points, right? But he instantly got feedback, which was, Hans, really great contributions, right? And that gave him the confidence to do more, Now, how that relates to decision making is that unless you know what you think and are willing to express it, right, how can you make a decision about anything, right? So it's very important for Hans to master this sense that his view mattered. What he'd been told when he was a kid was his view didn't matter.
I think a lot of people can relate to Hans's dilemma about maybe not necessarily knowing what you think. But this idea of creating space to decide and, as you were saying, even make bold decisions and really commit and have some conviction behind what you suggest and what you input. It can also manifest in other ways, but I want to talk in a bit about the decision fatigue and the studies that have been done around that, because I think that's really interesting. But there's this really interesting thing that you talk about, these 3 psychological realities that we're all facing, whether we identify or relate to Hans or not. What are they, Derek?
Yeah, well, so the first one is that you can't make a big decision, whether it's personal or professional, but we're focused on the professional in the book, without it causing you some anxiety, right? So if you avoid decisions or avoid roles which require decisions, which might mean that you're limiting your career, right? You're putting a sort of, you're putting your own glass ceiling over your head, because you think, well, I'm going to get anxious, I'm not going to know what the answer is, then that's the case for everybody. Right, and in fact, if you don't have anxiety about making an important decision, there's something wrong.
Yeah,
right.
I actually find that incredibly liberating, because I'm someone who probably does relate somewhat to Hans and finds decisions quite stressful, quite anxiety-inducing, and actually just accepting that making a decision is going to generate some anxiety. That in itself is incredibly liberating, because it takes away the underlying assumption that I need to be clear and free of anxiety in order to make this decision. It's like, no, make the decision. There'll be some anxiety, but actually it's a lot more freeing than just sitting in that space of indecision, which is just horrible. It feels really debilitating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the first psychological truth or reality. The second one's about information.
Yeah. So you're never going to have all the information you feel you need. Right. So again, you're constraining your ability to take a decision if you think I need to know everything before I decide, right, it isn't possible. Yes, you do have to open up your eyes and ears and listen, right, and work out what the possibilities are. But at the end of the day, you then have to kind of decide, right? There's a kind of rather vulgar saying, which I won't say, but it's true, right? You know, either do it or get off the pot, right? So in reality, you are going to always have the risk that there was something that you could have known or should have known that would have led to a different decision. But again, the point is that's always true. So you see, it's true with both of the things we've talking about, and also the third one when we get onto it. If you say, well, because I'm going to get anxious, I'm not going to make a decision, right? You will never make decisions. If you say, well, I'm not going to make a decision until I have all the information, it's impossible, you won't make decisions. So unconsciously what will happen is you will craft a life where you don't have to make decisions, which of course is not the reality of life. What you're really doing is crafting a life where everyone else is going to make your decisions for you.
There's something inherently passive about that, and something. One of my favourite acronyms is that you're either being reactive or creative,
right.
And it feels more like it's in the reactive side, in the sense of life being done to you rather than by you. So two powerful things there. What's the third psychological reality that we kind of have to face?
Well, the third one is the obvious one anyway, right? Which is you might be wrong, right? No one is perfect, right? Steve Jobs, who everyone lauds as this great, amazing thinker, creator, decision maker, right, said when people in Apple suggested the original iPhone was bigger, he said no one will ever want a phone that you can't put your hand around. Well, he was wrong, right? You know, so he also, have you heard of the Lisa computer?
Nope.
Right? One of Steve Jobs' great inventions that didn't go anywhere, right? So the fact that even Steve Jobs makes mistakes, right, doesn't mean that he's not a success, right? And to be honest, you could almost measure your success as a decision maker, not just by the number of decisions you get right, but also by the number of decisions you get wrong, because it's inevitable that some will go wrong. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't want to ever be wrong, you won't be making decisions, right? And if anyone ever says, well, I do make decisions, but I'm never wrong, right, they are deluding themselves, because they will have been wrong. And of course, that's the chance to learn from your mistakes, you know. So as Samuel Beckett said, you know, fail better, right? That is the purpose of this chapter of the book. It's to allow people to realize that making decisions, yes, you can have all sorts of, you know, we might talk about biases and you want to try and remove biases. You know, I think we may talk about the decision cycle and how you might make a decision. But all that comes to naught unless you embrace these three fundamental psychological truths, which is you're probably going to be anxious, you won't have all the information you think you might need, and you might be wrong. But that's okay, actually.
Yeah. And I think in the kind of Google-led world, it can be so tempting to just stay down the rabbit hole, to just, you know, there's so much talk now about anxiety. It's like, well, if I'm feeling anxious, something's wrong, or this idea of everything being really competitive and high performance driven. Oh, I don't want to make a mistake. And actually, I think those three things are really liberating, especially when you take them in tandem. So you mentioned the decision-making cycle. Let's take a look at that.
Yeah. So the decision-making cycle is a way of, and in fact, if anyone's checked in with our episode on reflection, they might remember the reflection cycle, right? So the decision-making cycle is saying, look, what is your goal, right? So in other words, what's the desired outcome of the decision, right? What are you actually deciding about, and have clarity on that. And often people don't have that, you see. So the goalposts move. You know, we thought we were deciding on how, you know, on the most brilliant thing we could do, and actually we're sort of deciding on the thing we can afford to do. They're very different, right? So you've got to define with clarity what the decision is. And then you need to reflect on it a bit. And as I say, there's a whole chapter in the book on reflecting. Gather data, analyze, right? But also tap into your intuition. Intuition is a very powerful thing, right? And you kind of need to do a dance between the two. You know, my intuition says X, check that out with a bit of data. But you can't, as you said, go down a rabbit hole of that, right? And do it endlessly. at some point you are going to have to actually make a decision, which is about listing the alternatives, right? So you need to kind of, to an extent, formalize what your options are, and then again reflect on each of them, and then you have to actually decide, right? And then you can review and reflect how your decision went, and you might learn something about that from future decisions. But it's interesting, the part of the book that's about to think, and to decide is the end of that bit, is the third one. I like to sum it up with, the type of thing. If it's reflection, it's primarily about yourself, but also about the world. And the dynamic is to open up, close somewhat, but stay open for more. So you're reflecting to a purpose, but it's sort of ongoing. Learning, which is that chapter 2, is primarily about the world, but also about yourself. And that's to open up and keep opening up, right? You never stop learning. And then deciding, which we're talking about now, is the focus is a particular issue or question. And the dynamic is open up and then close, and make that decision.
I think there's something, a business, a team, an organisation can recover from a misstep, but actually just being in that state of indecision, of not committing, not making a choice, can be really, really damaging to the team, to the organisation as a whole. There's something I like in the book that's very practical, is the discussion of decision fatigue.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, there was a study of a lot of parole decisions that judges would make. And I think they were a study of about 1,100 of them, just over. And what they found was it was nothing to do, that the decision as to whether parole was granted or not did not in the end come down to the ethnicity of the person. It came down to nothing about the difference or diversity or the case, the details of the case. It came down to the time of day. When judges were refreshed first thing in the morning or after a break, they were much more likely to grant parole. I think it was something like 72% of cases got granted parole. Don't quote me on the stats, but it's really significant. And it dropped and dropped and dropped because as the judges got more and more fatigued by having to make more and more decisions, they hedged their bets.
Yeah.
Because the complexity of having to kind of consider all the nuances and all the possibilities of what might happen, it does two things. One of them is it does make you more likely to make an impulsive decision. And that's that moment, I know it in myself, where you just go, oh, I'll just have that for dinner. I'll just reach for the donut. I'll just go for the easy option. Right. But for the judges, the easy option was just to not grant parole.
Right, okay. So all things being equal, better not to.
Yeah. And then when they take a break, they come back and their decision-making skills are completely refreshed because their brains had a chance to switch off.
Well, there you go. I suppose the lesson there is if you've got a tricky conversation with your boss, do it after lunch, right? After they've had a break or something.
Exactly.
I mean, Barack Obama talked about how he only had 2 types of suits and some ties that matched the suits. So his wardrobe was very minimalist, right? It wasn't to do with taste. He said, I decide so many things all day, I don't want to make any other decisions. He didn't want to have to stand at his wardrobe thinking, what ties should I wear with that suit? Because that would mean that he couldn't take a decision much later, that was more important.
And there's plenty of those examples. You can just go into a coffee shop nowadays and be overwhelmed by having to simply choose what to drink.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another thing that we have to consider in decision making and creating the space to decide and to decide well, which is biases, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of different biases. There's quite a lot of talk nowadays, isn't there, about unconscious biases. And I know that Harvard, I think it was, released a bunch of tests that you can take to see if you have an unconscious bias around size or around race or around age. Yeah. But in the book, you talk about different kinds of unconscious bias. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, these are kind of classic kind of things that psychology has known for quite a long time, right? So they're less to do with being biased in those ways, and more to do, and more to do with kind of thing. I mean, I'll give you, 2 or 3 examples. I mean, optimism bias. We overestimate the likelihood of good things happening and underestimate the chance of bad things happening, right? Source credibility, which does touch on diversity. We tend to accept things from people who are similar to us, or who we like more, rather than those who differ from us or we don't like. So again, it's not to do with the quality of the advice you're getting or the, support. It's, are they like me? And if they're like me, I'll tend to think they're right. Recency, we tend to take more account of things that happened recently and less accounts of things we discovered or experienced in the past. Now that affects, people having their annual review, right? When the boss will be going on and on about the thing that happened 2 weeks ago. Well, there's a clue in the title. It's annual. So if you're doing one of those, by the way, you have to, again, create space to stop and reflect a little bit and think, how has this person done over the last year? I don't just want to think about the last thing they did, which of course, if you're lazy thinking, that's what will happen, right? What Daniel Kahneman called fast thinking. You need to bring a bit of slow thinking to something like that. And I think the book covers 10, the sunk cost fallacy. Is a great one. It's we persevere with things even when we have realised they won't work, just because we've already put so much time and effort into them, which is a sort of definition of insanity if you think about it, right? It's like, this is a lost hope. Right? I'm flogging a dead horse, whatever cliche you want to use, but I'm still going to do it because I've done all that work on it, or I spent all that money on it. Well, no, don't spend any more on it. Don't spend any more time or money on something that isn't right? But it's very hard for us to do that. So being aware of these 10 biases, and there's actually hundreds, but these, I think, are the 10 that come up a lot in the work I do with kind of business leaders, that will affect the quality of your decision making, just bringing yourself, these biases into your awareness.
Thank you, Derek. I have one question for you to close this episode. If someone is watching this who feels that they don't have any issue making decisions, I just bam, 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 I just make decisions, it's not an issue for me. The thing that's on my mind is that the chapter in the book, the idea is about creating space to decide, and I wonder what you would say to that kind of person.
Yeah, so I think that whether you think you're good at making decisions or bad at making decisions, stopping and thinking about how you make decisions and what the outcomes are is of benefit, right? It may be you're good at it, but maybe you're not. Maybe when you look under the bonnet, you're not so good at it, right? Vice versa. Maybe you think you're not good at it, but if you look under the bonnet, you kind of are, right? So self-reflection is something that everyone should do, whether they think they need it or not, right? Because the chances are, if you do it properly and you're a human being, you will find out that you do need it.
And that's what I love about the book, is how all the concepts tie together, because inherent in what you're saying is the idea that we need to create the space and the time and the right environment and the right partnerships and relationships to do this self-reflection. Reflecting is chapter 1. And by doing that, you learn more about yourself, which is chapter 2.
Yeah, and then you're in a better position to make better decisions, which is chapter 3.
Great, thank you so much. So to find out more, head over to derekdrapers.space and join us for a future episode.